Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Sarah Webb, and I am your guest host today for Art School Live. And today, my guest is Justin Worrell. And artists often say values do the work, colors get the credit. And today, Justin is going to prove it for us. So, Justin, welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Real quickly, we're going to talk a little bit about tonalism, its origins and traditions current to today. And then I'm going to take you through a little exercise that I'd like to do to hone and strengthen my value structure within my work using just two colors.
Perfect. That sounds great. And without further ado, let's get this show started.
It's Art School Live with Eric Rhodes. Now, here's your host, Eric Rhodes.
Good morning. So as you can see, I am not Eric Rhodes. My name is Sarah Webb, and I'm your guest host today. I am working for my regular job at Streamline. I'm the vendor sales manager. So I get to work with all of our wonderful vendors and sponsors at our events. But today our guest is Justin Worrell, and he's going to share with us a two-color exercise that will transform your paintings. So Justin, take it away.
Thanks, Sarah. Hey, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today. Just by way of sort of showing where we're intending to go, this is sort of our destination. I have a couple examples here to kind of show where I'm trying to go today. This is really just a two-color exercise, thinking strictly about values and how I'm a landscape painter. Although we can talk about this later, I don't really consider myself as a painter of landscapes. We can get into that later. But here's an example. I have one other example of how this kind of works and where we're going to be going. Okay. So to kind of set the stage here, so I use water-soluble oil paints, and there isn't any real reason for that other than when I am done painting, I clean up with soap and water. And I'm sort of a guy, I don't know if it's a guy thing, but I'm just one of those people who prefers, less fuss, less production. When I started painting, I had a small child, dog, cat, so the solvent stuff I was kind of leaning away from. And I found these wonderful things called water-soluble oil paints, which I haven't really noticed any kind of difference in between traditional oils and these. But so that's what I use. And the two colors that I'm going to be using today are two transparent colors. It's a transparent oxide red, okay? And then we're going to use a phthalo green. And if you're familiar with my work, if you've seen images of my work, these two colors make up the bulk of the dark values that you find within my paintings. So whenever you see a dark value, it's largely those two colors that make up sort of a nice transparent, kind of a rich sort of dark tone, which is where the light within my paintings and how I approach landscape painting. That's where the light sort of gets its power from. It gets its power from the dark and from the surrounding values around the light source. So, and then what we have here, what I typically paint on, is just a very simple hard wood panel. It's a very smooth panel, like mirror glass, like a mirror, like a pane of glass. And what I've found for myself in my own work, the smooth and this, students who take classes with me or workshops, who maybe come from working on something that's more grabby when it comes to paint. So maybe like a canvas that has a pretty good weave on it, something that the paint has to hold on to. So when you're making your marks, the paint really adheres to the surface. This does not. This kind of does the opposite, but which can be a challenge if you're not used to working this way. But for me, in how I paint and my concentration on atmospheric effects, moodiness, subtle gradations between areas of transparency and opacity. I've found that having a really smooth surface where the paint really has a difficult time adhering to actually helps to that effect. So what we're going to do, and I largely paint from, I guess you could say, imagination. I don't really know what that means, really. Or, you know, some people might say memory. I don't really know what that means either. I think that definition might vary from artist to artist, but I sort of just, I take the toning. So I've toned it. So this came pre-gessoed. I tone it with an acrylic, transparent red oxide acrylic paint, but I think of it more of like staining the surface as opposed to toning it. So I kind of want to have, if you look closely, you can see areas of that transparency and opacity where you can kind of see it's put on so thinly that the white of the ground can actually shine through a little bit. And I paint pretty much all in one go, alla prima, and doing it this way, just doing this one very simple first step, can add to depth within the painting. It can give the illusion that I have painted in layers, or that I am glazing, or that I'm painting, a grisaille, or and letting that dry and then coming over the top with color, with transparent color. I don't do any of that, but doing this one simple step I've found, and also being consciously aware of putting the paint on thinly, allows these two simple layers to kind of shine through on my work, which helps with that depth, but it also helps unify the painting, because areas of this will kind of shine through as I painted very thinly. So hopefully that sets the stage. If there's any other questions, Sarah, just let me know, and feel free to interrupt me as I get going here.
Yeah, sure. And actually, I have a question. So
Sure.
just how you were talking about how you paint from imagination, memory, what that may, the general vibe. When you first started painting, did you paint more from life or from photographs to kind of learn, how to paint from memory? Or was it kind of you just started from that naturally?
I've tried. It's a good question. And I think students need to kind of understand, we try, good painters will pretty much try anything. It's certainly at first. I mean, I started painting late in life, in my 30s. Actually, I wasn't even an art student. I have a career going today, actually, that's unrelated to art. But in the beginning, I went to the art store and I bought cheap acrylic paint, cheap canvas, cheap this, cheap brushes, cheap that. I tried that. I've tried painting plein air, which I don't do any longer. I sketch, I draw. I do pretty much all the things that I guess your typical artist would do in order to kind of develop, to develop. But also there's a side to this which I think it's overlooked, and that a lot of folks concentrate on sort of that technical material stuff. What paints does Justin use? What brushes does he use? What palette knives? What panels? What this and that? I think if students are going to really develop, there's a whole side, a philosophical side, a mental intention side to painting that I think often gets overlooked. And I always encourage my students, look, I can get up here and do a demo for you during this workshop, and we can spend a great week together or a weekend together, and we can really get into the technical side of this. But you really have to understand, when you step up to the easel, you need to understand your intention when it comes to painting. And that's sort of where tonalism came in for me around 2017, 2018. I learned about this ism, one of the there's isms throughout art history, and kind of I researched a bit of the reasons some of these older painters kind of their philosophical artistic approach to creating art, which was sort of this blending of sort of two opposites. And it's funny, everything in painting seems to be about opposites. Whether that's opposites between light and dark, or between warm, cool, or hard and soft edges. Even on the palette. So your contemporary colors, red and green, and violet and purple, or violet and yellow, and how you work with these opposites to create something that's unified, has a direction and a purpose. And I think when it comes to tonalism, that's well exemplified in that style of painting, in that approach to painting, when we're trying to take the temporal and the eternal, these two kind of ideas of earthly forms like trees and fields and pools of water and lakes and streams, and using these kind of symbolically to sort of transcend into a different space. And I think there's a fair bit of confusion actually about tonalism and what it is and what it isn't, and how it differs from all the other kind of isms throughout art history. So I'm not really like thinking about much here, just sort of putting on some paint. I have a small little thing of medium that I use. It's really nothing fancy. I really just use it to kind of get the paint sort of flowing. And as I make marks, I sort of organically kind of feed off of those marks, and hopefully something will sort of kind of start to emerge. What I'll also do is take, paper towel, kind of smear this around a little bit, maybe get a little oil on it, create something that's kind of like a sky value. Okay. Now, because my surface doesn't really accept paint too well, I do employ some palette knives, which help me lay on thicker opaque paint, which can help me with some of these passages that I want to kind of darken and deepen and sort of play with a little bit.
And Justin, I think this is an especially good question because you're using such a smooth surface, but
Yeah.
does using that short-haired brush help give you that dry brush technique on that smooth surface, kind of that you're looking for in the tonalism approach?
Kind of. The real secret to the dry brush actually is this guy. So I employ, this is just sort of a hardware store, a regular painter's hardware store brush that I will use to kind of smooth out some of these passages. So this brush, as it sort of goes on, will make marks, right? So we have, some marks here and there. And but what I found is if I keep this brush clean and I have just a little rag, and I can come back in and sort of soften areas, thin areas out. If I'm painting in color, if I wanted to overlay some color and then spread it out thinly, this helps enhance that effect that I was talking about earlier, where I'm trying to really paint thinly to allow some of these layers, the ground layer, the toned layer, to kind of shine through and have some kind of a glowy sort of effect. So that's where the dry brush comes in. I don't put too much, I guess, emphasis or I'm not too concerned about the brushes. These are just probably, generic oil brushes that you could probably find in most places. Everything should be sort of in service to the final product. Whatever gets you there in the end is sort of the important part. And how you do that is sort of experimenting and playing with different techniques, different materials, that kind of thing. one of the interesting things about tonalism is it you know, a lot of people think sort of it's a sort of a reference to how a painting looks, kind of a surface level type of thing. You know, tonalism as a term itself, if we just look at that, folks might be interested, or may not even know that as an ism, as sort of an official sort of pronoun, much like Impressionism, wasn't even coined until about 1972. And I have that book right here, actually. This was a catalog put together for the De Young Museum by someone named Wanda Korn, who kind of formalized this idea, this way of painting. And she sort of names about 4 or 5 what she would call, I guess we could call kind of the founding folks of tonalism. And she lists 2 primary ones, one being George Inness and the other being Whistler, who she kind of credits as being the pioneers. And she also lists a couple other folks. I think Dewing was one. I think Alexander Wyant was another. But this style of painting is really more of a spiritual term. It's not really about, I mean, I guess you could say it's not really about the physical quality of the paint or how a painting looks. I mean, I think some people might look at, and this happens a lot online, especially people will look at a picture of a Monet painting or a Turner painting and say sort of, hey, are these tonalist paintings? And the answer to that is no. And the reason being, if we're sort of looking at George Inness as the source material for this style of painting, we have to kind of look, and we're fortunate enough that we have a lot of his writings and his teachings and his, evidence of his philosophical approach and how he kind of arrived at this style of painting available to us to read. And that's kind of the key part, I guess. You have to do a little bit of work, a little bit of reading to kind of figure this out. But really, it's it's less about detail. It's less about an analytical approach to painting. It's really, like I said, more of a spiritual exercise. As opposed to something like Luminism, which was also kind of sort of contemporary, or just kind of before, well, contemporary to Inness and those guys, 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, where you look at Luminist paintings are very much sort of an optimistic sort of approach, an analytical approach to landscape painting, kind of this, also kind of understanding what was going on in the country at the time, this sort of idea of manifest destiny and, kind of an empirical march from sea to shining sea. But there were also things going on like the Civil War and coming out of that, and how do you, Reconstruction and inequalities in wealth distribution and this and that, and which some of that is probably also relevant to today. Which I think is why we've seen sort of a resurgence in this, an interest in this kind of painting.
Yeah, and Tracy mentioned in the comments a book on tonalism that she refers to a lot is A History of American Tonalism by David A. Cleveland.
Yeah.
So and it's kind of, like you said, talking about the things that you've gone on about and how it actually kind of gave rise to American modernism too. So everyone check that book out. I'll post a link to it in the comments.
Yep, that's a good one. I think most folks who have an interest in tonalism kind of consider that, kind of foundational to. It certainly had an influence in the resurgence of the interest in this kind of painting. There's and it's large. I mean, it's like 600 pages. I have a copy. That I reference a lot and I've read. It's not really a book that you kind of sit down and read. from cover to cover. I mean, I treat it more like a textbook, and there are certainly some interesting ideas that go in that are presented in that book. In this, I think, being completely honest, I do sort of consider Innis sort of the origin of this manner of painting. And I think it's important to kind of understand why and sort of where he was coming from. And I think a good way to do that is to maybe talk a little bit about, how this compares to other art movements. And what I'm about to say, I don't have anything against any of these movements at all. I mean, I certainly consider, like, take Impressionism. I certainly consider Impressionism to be, probably one of those movements that's on the Mount Rushmore of art movements. If there was an art Mount Rushmore for that kind of thing, I think most people love Impressionism. I certainly do myself. But if you think about intention in painting, and you think about those folks, those Impressionists, and what they did, going out into the countryside, painting what they saw in front of them. And I like to use as a way to kind of explain and differentiate how I approach painting with how maybe an Impressionist might. If you think about Monet, okay, and you think about all those times where he painted in succession, haystacks or the bridges of London. And I think the best example I could use is the cathedral in Rouen, where he painted, I don't know, it's like 20 different canvases. And as the story goes, he would sit across the street from the cathedral, and as the lighting effect changed upon the facade of the cathedral, he would pull up, the relevant panel that he was working on, or canvas that he was working on, and try to capture that lighting effect. So for Innis, that is very much going halfway in terms of creating art or image making. That's very much a seeing with your physical eye type of approach. When I think, Innis would probably argue that we can see so much more than with our physical eye. And so, but then the question becomes, how do you sort of tap into getting beyond that physical temporal and getting into something that transcends, if that makes sense. And he had some pretty nasty things to say about Impressionism. Called them shams, accused them of having unexpressed vision, these kinds of, but he also had some pretty interesting takes on a lot of different artists. And, he wasn't the biggest fan of Turner either. And I got to be honest, I'm such a big Turner guy. He's one of the three that I list in my artist statement as kind of my key influences. And I love Turner so much that my 8-year-old son is named Turner Worrell. So I certainly understand, I have a love of Turner and his work. But if you do take some of Turner's most famous paintings, they're full of narrative. His slave ship, Innis called that painting claptrap. He said that there's really nothing in it. Same thing with Fighting Temeraire. It's very much a narrative kind of driven way of painting. And for the true tonalist, these paintings that I'm creating are largely devoid of that kind of narrative. And there's a reason for that, because I'm trying to use these forms that we all have kind of a familiarity with when we go out in nature and we observe it, and we might paint it or sketch it or just be outside and breathe it in and be in the moment with this physical world. But I think there's certainly something that's beyond, and I don't know what that is. And I kind of struggle, and painting this way is sort of a way for me to work on that, to kind of explore my sense of spirituality. And I want to be careful about the words that I'm using. I'm not really talking about religion. I'm talking about something that's more holistic, something that's kind of a bigger umbrella, a bigger tent, just a general sense of spirituality. And how do we kind of tap into that and transcend? And that's sort of, I think, where Innis and those folks were coming from in terms of how do you create a really compelling image. And look, I mean, Innis was never really totally devoid of narrative himself. I mean, he, would even in his later 1880s, even early 1890s before his death, he would include things like the anonymous figure, which, certainly is some kind of narrative and kind of places it more on the temporal side, but he would often keep them below the horizon. And the reason for that is, and if you tried this exercise, you'd probably see what he was talking about. Once that figure sort of breaks the horizon, the painting more becomes about that person. You kind of wonder about that person. So as the viewer, you're kind of wondering about that person. You're not maybe thinking about yourself or thinking, more, self-contemplation, self-reflection. And these are kind of the themes that tonalists, certainly like myself, try to tap into. These quieter moments, get the viewer to more think, in a different sense. I don't want to place them in a certain field. I live in Virginia, so I don't really want to place someone in the field in Virginia. I've had people come up to my paintings and say, "Oh, that looks like I grew up in Michigan," or "Oh, that looks like a place in Florida." Like they're sort of designed to not necessarily be of a certain specific place, and that's done again with intention. I can go on and on, so please just interrupt me. I tend to babble. So.
No, you're good. This is exactly what we want to hear. But sounds like George was pretty savage.
I tell you, I've read stories where he'd sit people down in his studio and basically download on them, all of his ideas on art. I mean, the guy, I got to give it to him. I mean, he was always searching for something, which is something that I certainly can relate to. Always trying to find something, something that made sense to him, something that kind of worked. Always kind of searching, and he, you also didn't want to leave him alone in your studio, because as the stories goes, he did this to his son. Even his son was a painter, George Ennis Jr. And his son, recounts this time where his dad came in and they were looking at one of his son's paintings, and his father basically took up a brush and painted over it. And it, just a very interesting guy, but also very, to your point, absolutely very savage. Wasn't afraid to speak his mind, even though some of his positions I don't think would hold up today in terms of, what we've sort of identified as important culturally from an artistic and art history perspective. So this, you may have seen me use, and this is kind of like, this might be a little bit like, how my 8-year-old might approach mark making, but I found this to be such an effective tool. This is just a paper towel that I sort of drench the tips in. And, I'll go in, I think a lot of painters always have to fight this, this battle between being too fussy, but we want to be painterly. We want to be too fine and get too far into the details. I found that this thing really keeps things loose. It injects a little bit of chaos. There's a little bit of randomness with how kind of floppy this can be. And as I kind of go in and make marks, I see kind of what develops. Now, on the flip side of that, after you do that, you do kind of need to come in and sort of clean things up a little bit. And that's what I use this kind of dry brush for.
It does seem like, especially when you're doing the two colors, you said you were using the paper towel to add some randomness, a little bit of chaos. And it does seem like if you were somehow accidentally or stumbling more into repetitive marks, it would be really obvious in a tonalism painting.
Yeah, I generally, when I'm painting, I mean, I use a pretty limited palette anyway. I mean, if I have every color on my palette out that I use, it's 11 colors. That's it. But I generally stick to about 5 or 6, maybe 7. And usually that kind of just depends on the complexity of and how the painting develops. Perhaps even how big the panel is that I'm working on. That might sort of influence how many colors I may or might need. But I mean, again, everything is sort of done in service to this. What does this need? And you have to be able to kind of develop your eye, step back a lot as you're doing this, think about things of composition, think about light and dark, what really just kind of what the painting itself needs. And then the hard part is then being able to, make it happen. But again, that just comes with practice and time. And I got to tell you, painting is just one of those sweat equity kind of endeavors. I mean, if you want to get good, you just sort of have to put in the work. And there's really not much you can kind of do other than put in the work. So when you look back at a lot of those older master sort of paintings, several times, many times you'll see they employ the use of water as kind of a mechanism. I like it. It serves several different purposes. One, on the technical side, it can serve as sort of an entree point, a natural entree point for the viewer's eye to kind of come in and be introduced into the composition. Okay. And then from there, hopefully you can construct the image in a way that can then make that eye sort of float around. Okay. But also, I mean, these moments, these quieter moments, these still moments, these reflective moments, it also serves that kind of purpose as well, which is nice, which also kind of gets to the, so much in painting is about opposites. Okay. I think we might beef this up a little bit. So we have a little bit of a central sort of composition, and don't be afraid of stuff like that. I mean, I think there are certain kind of, I don't want to call them guidelines or rules with painting, right? It's like don't put your focal point in the center. Don't use black. I don't know where that came from. That one seems, like old bad news that you probably shouldn't pay too much attention to. But I frequently will put the center of attention or the focal point near the center. I mean, and there's certain way that you can balance that and make that work for you. But don't be too afraid to do that or to experiment with it.
All right, so I have a question. So is this an underpainting that you always make before you paint a normal painting, or is this something separate? I think this person came in a little late. So
yeah, no worries. Yeah, the good question. Look, that can serve both purposes. Okay, I use these as an exercise. They're almost like a palette cleanser in a way, right? Because I'm painting in color and this panel and this panel and this panel, and painting in color and color. Just switching it up and doing something like this again is sort of like an amuse-bouche. Like if you're out at a tasting menu at a nice restaurant, you get something to kind of clean your palette a little bit from the heaviness or whatever of painting in full color. So this can serve that kind of purpose and give you, a different experience. Okay. But yes, I mean, you could totally, and I have done this. I don't do it often, but like when I do have a finished piece kind of like this, once it's completely dry, I can go over that with full color, and I already have that roadmap, right? I already got that roadmap of where I'm going to go. I have my values figured out, which is usually, if there's a problem in your painting, it's usually your value structure. So stop, take a picture with your phone, turn it into black and white, and then that should really show you where your values might be having an issue.
And say say you're going to keep this as is, fully dry. You're not planning on doing full color over it or anything.
Mm-hmm.
Say once it's fully dry, you're like, I would like to darken the tone a little bit more. Would you resort to glazing, or would you go back in with your paints?
Probably, well, on this, gosh, if I did this for a while, for like an hour or so, and I didn't like it, I mean, the beautiful thing about this is I could just wipe it, and it's gone, and I can just start over. But I suppose you could pretty much do any of those things that you wanted to, and so I don't know if that answers the question. Hopefully, it does, but
I think it does.
Yeah. So I might want to think about maybe. So look, I mean, we've kind of, when folks are kind of starting out, and I don't generally like, formulas within painting, because, most of the time in painting, it's not like math, right? So like in math, 1 + 1 is 2, and it's probably always going to be 2. But in art, it seems like 1 + 1 can equal 17 sometimes. So, I think a lot of folks are always looking kind of for formulas, or how do I, how do I approach this problem? And there's a formula answer for it. What I recommend folks is, Carlson's book on landscape painting does have a bit of a formula in it, okay, where he talks about value structure during kind of a bright day with sunshine. Like, your sky will be the lightest value, and then followed by like reflected water, which is a little bit darker, and then a little bit darker might be those angular planes like hills or mountains in the background, a little bit darker, and then a little bit darker as you kind of come to the mid and foreground, and the darkest part are going to be these verticals, so these trees. And that can be kind of a jumping off point. If you can kind of play with that in terms of a formula, that might be helpful for you in terms of trying to get a grasp on how to construct a landscape. And then you can start to play with it, because like in a snow painting, that value structure is going to be different, because generally the snow is going to be the lightest value, and then you have to figure out how everything else kind of plays in the sandbox with that snow. Now, what I have here are large blocks of sort of tone, right? So I've got lighter tone in the sky, I've got a little bit of reflected water, which is a little bit darker. Then I have a little bit darker kind of mid ground here, and here's my darkest point. But these are really large blocks. Now, what I found is if I take a little liner or rigger brush, and I can kind of come in here and just kind of pull something up like that, I start to kind of, it's a little more detailed. It's a little bit of a harder edge, but I can come in here and I can put in these verticals and kind of break up this sense of these larger blocks of chunks of value and tone, okay? And it doesn't take much. Just kind of come in here like that. And you can practice this, like if you're, in a meeting at work, and you can take, and I do this myself, you got a pad of pencil and you're listening to someone you don't want to listen to who's giving a presentation. You can just sort of practice this on your own and develop, these sort of tree shapes, which is what I'm sort of doing here. And again, it doesn't have to be the most detailed thing. You don't have to worry about it too much. I mean, you want to kind of skirt that line of between, realism and, enough information to convey trees or bushes or what have you. Now, because I also have this large block of color, large block of value, you can kind of do the opposite of what I just did, and come in here and maybe pull out a tree. Hopefully that comes up on the screen there, but you can, and that's a little bit too bright, so just come back in with a brush and you can kind of tamp that down. But what that starts to do is to create depth within your painting. And I really haven't done a whole lot in order to accomplish that. But it starts to say, okay, so this tree is in front of these forms. These trees are probably back and beyond these forms. You can soften some of these trees in the background just by softening their value, because we have an understanding of sort of aerial perspective. You know, as things are in the distance, they're not as clear, right? They might be, the value's not as strong as stuff that's closer to you. The details are not as clear as stuff that's closer to you. And so kind of playing with this push and pull, you can start to develop some pretty neat little effects, you know, just by doing basically, you know, something kind of like that. And then, how are we doing on time, Sarah?
I actually was just going to say we've got about 10 minutes left. And I was also going to say you can really see, you know, pulling out those trees really, really added. I mean, just doing one or two of those really added quite a lot of depth to the painting.
Right, right. And it's a, you know, pretty simple thing to do. You know, just, you know, compositionally, you have to kind of step back and kind of pull from your knowledge of composition, you know, what kind of makes sense within the composition, like where verticals make sense. I start to kind of think about, you know, a lighting source. So how, you know, where might there be within this composition if I wanted to put more of a focal point. And that's, you know, using this technique is pretty easy to do. So I just have a little spray bottle here of water. And because I'm using water soluble oils, you know, I can take a little paper towel and put a little bit of water in it, and I can maybe play with something and sort of pull it out where it might make sense. And I'm just sort of drawing this in. I mean, it's, okay. Just going to reload my brush a little bit. All right, and I can kind of come in here and think about maybe there's some transitional tones. So when you go to paint, like in color, when you put in sort of an effect like that, you have to kind of think about, if you really want kind of a glowing effect, maybe you have a really, really bright spot, you surround that with tones that are not as saturated and values that are a little bit darker. And so that's how you sort of start to get a kind of glowing effect within your art. And we can sort of maybe echo that a little bit down here. If this is water. Something like that. And as you can see, you know, it's been 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes. And, you know, even with me talking and trying to explain all these things in a live show, kind of how you can develop a composition in a landscape.
Yeah, and I was going to ask, how long do these usually take you? Or you just kind of go with the flow, you know? How long do you usually like to paint for?
Well, these you can do, in a couple minutes, right? I mean, you really, and you can do them on different sizes. You can do them, you know, you don't need to spend, you know, your whole night doing them. And when I do them, if I'm just alone here in my studio with my cat or my dog, you know, I can bang these out pretty fast. But I paint pretty quickly anyway, so I have a little bit of an advantage. I'm kind of forced to, because my painting time is sort of dictated or predicated upon when my kids go to bed, or it used to be. When they went to bed, I'd come down to the studio and paint. And so I had to kind of develop a technique that was perhaps a little bit faster in order to get stuff done. But yeah, I mean, you know, these shouldn't take too long. And we can pull out maybe a little more here. Okay, maybe a little too much. So we kind of come back in, play with these marks. to suggest different planes within the landscape. Just give it a little once over here, kind of soften some of these areas. And then again, I just use my little spritzer to clean this, hardware store brush. Got to keep that clean. And so yeah, so now we have sort of a composition. We can kind of go. We can go in and refine some of these. We can deepen some of these darks. We start to sort of refine certain passages. Put a little more of a defining value in between these different planes and different areas of the composition. Maybe clean up this edge a little bit.
I'm loving that texture in the lower right corner. Yeah, it's just great.
And again, it's not, I'm not Michelangelo. I mean, it doesn't take a lot. I mean, just sort of got to figure out kind of what tools make sense for you and go with it.
Yeah, and one more time, just before we've got just a couple minutes left, but before you wrap up, can you just tell us again what color you used for the underpainting and then the two colors you used for the study?
Yeah, so the underpainting is done in acrylic. So I start with a gessoed panel. I put over an acrylic transparent red oxide, and I put it on very thinly. Think more about staining it rather than sort of painting it to tone it. And then I just use water mixable, water soluble oil paints in transparent red oxide and phthalo green. And you can get kind of a variety of certain tones and different glowy kind of effects with, really just very simply.
Yeah, and if you didn't have an acrylic for the staining, you could use a thinned out your transparent red oxide, your oil, just let it dry.
You could, yep, and just let it dry. Yep, that's certainly doable. That's certainly allowed. So, and you can kind of fuss with this until you ruin it. But
yeah, well, that looks great. This is such a great exercise. Like you said, you can do it as a palette cleanser. You can do it as a value study. You can let it dry, kind of go over from here with color. Really quite versatile for what you're feeling that day.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's really helped. It's really helped me. I mean, landscape painters need to have a really solid foundation about value structure, perspective, aerial perspective, linear perspective. Just as sort of a base before you kind of get, going into the full blown color and really big panels and big paintings. But yeah, it's just one approach. Hopefully this was somewhat instructive and helpful for folks.
Yeah, for sure. I think this is one we're definitely going to be rewatching from the beginning and referencing. That was so great. Thank you so much, Justin. Wonderful.
Well, thank you.
Love it. All right, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this demo. Don't forget to visit Justin's website. It's justintworrell.com and follow him on Instagram at JustinTWorrell. And Justin, do you have any classes or workshops coming up? Any studio shows or anything?
Yeah, I do actually. I do teach somewhat. I have actually, if you want to go to Europe, I have an Italian workshop in November of this year. There are a couple seats left, I understand. That info can be found on my website, or I'm pretty easy to find online. So that info is pretty easy to find. But yeah, that's the next one.
All right. I mean, who doesn't want to go to Italy to do some tonalism? I mean, that sounds pretty awesome. Also, I'm going to take this a step further. Speaking of Italy, speaking of wine, not necessarily Italian wine, but you have an animal named after a delicious wine, I believe.
Yeah, my wife and I were big wine people, and my dog's name is Pino. He was sleeping on the chair behind me, but he's gone. But yeah, Pino like the grape. Yeah.
Adorable. We love it. All right, Justin, thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah. All right. Okay, everyone. Well, I have a free gift for you today. Download the free video. It's 97 Incredible Art Secrets. Go to 97artsecrets.com/ASL to claim yours. And exciting, something to tell you, you can now watch every stage of the plein air convention and the paintouts from anywhere thanks to Pace Streaming. If you want to experience the convention but can't attend physically, sign up. Go to pleinairconvention.com/streaming. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel, Art School Live on YouTube and at Eric Rhodes on Instagram. And everyone, thank you for joining me today. Thank you for being wonderful viewers. Again, thank you to Justin, and we'll see you all tomorrow. So bye, everybody.